Hey YouTube, this is Ian from Big Rock Media. Now, when you attend a dual sport or adventure ride and all your buddies are gathering at the trailhead or wherever you're meeting for your ride, one of the most common discussion topics is tire pressure. People are asking you, oh, what pressure do you run in those knobby tires? What pressure do you have in those 50/50 tires, or pressures for different sizes of motorcycle? So today we're going to take a deep dive into tire pressure and tell you everything you need to know to understand what tire pressure you should run in your motorcycle and why. So first we need to understand what pressure actually is. So in physics, force is simply pressure divided by area. A lot of you have heard the story about someone lying on a bed of nails, and this is a perfect example of pressure. If you were to lie down on a board with a single nail sticking up, you'd be visiting the hospital. But if you were to lie down on a bed of nails evenly distributed with about 1,000 nails on them, you'd be fine. And the reason is that the pressure is divided over much more area, meaning the pressure is lower. Algebra is really cool stuff, very useful. But we're not here to talk about nails, we're here to talk about tire pressure. So you might be surprised to know that even if you have a flat tire, there is still technically pressure in the tire. And this has to do with understanding how our atmosphere works. Thankfully, we live on a planet with a pressurized atmosphere. There's a lot of column of air above us which presses down and pressurizes the atmosphere. This is why when you go out and ride your motorcycle at 70 miles an hour, you feel wind resistance. You're feeling the pressure of that air. So it turns out that atmospheric pressure at sea level is around 15 psi absolute pressure. So really, when you take your gauge and measure your tire pressures, you're not measuring the absolute pressure, you're measuring the gauge pressure, or the relative pressure difference between the atmosphere and the pressurized air inside your tire. So let's talk about how we measure tire pressure. So when you look at tire pressure, you're going to see three different units of measurement. In the United States and other areas, you're going to see PSI, or pounds per square inch. In some countries, you're going to see kPa, which means kilopascals. And then in some areas of the world, you're going to hear bars. Now, it doesn't really matter which one you use as long as you know which one you're using and you're not mixing them up. So for instance, 29 psi is around 2 bars, but it's around 200 kilopascals. There's a big difference between the units. So having pressure in your tire above the atmospheric pressure is what allows your tire to push down against the ground and support the weight of the motorcycle. And also your passenger, your cargo, your 10 sets of fog lights, your panniers, and all the other stuff you take with you. If you've ever tried to push around a bike with 2 flat tires and you could barely push it, this is why. The tire requires relative pressure against the ground to hold up the weight and to reduce the friction of the tire against the ground. So today's kind of cold, it's fall, I'm wearing a jacket as you can see, and that leads me to temperature. We have to talk about temperature if we're going to talk about pressure. So if you paid attention in science class, you remember that pressure and temperature are related, they're tied together. So if one goes up, the other one changes. This is why if you check your tire pressure early morning, like if I were to check this bike right now, it's around 45 degrees outside and it has not been ridden, you're going to get one pressure. But if I rode the bike and check my bike at my lunch stop and check the pressure then, the gauge is going to read quite a bit higher. All that has to do with the change in temperature of the air. Now, a lot of you will be familiar with this because your car probably has a little warning light. It's a little icon that's like a kind of a crushed tire symbol. And what that means is that your pressure has fallen out of range. Now, a lot of modern motorcycles are starting to have tire pressure monitoring as well. So this time of year, a lot of people get into their car in the morning and they see that dash light lit up and they're wondering, well, wait a minute, I thought my pressures were correct. What's going on? Well, what happened is the ambient air temperature dropped dramatically in the fall or winter and it changes the pressure. So the way that pressure and temperature are related for our purposes here, so a change in air temperature of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit is going to equate to a pressure change of about 1 psi. All right, so this is something that you really need to understand. When you read the recommended pressure for your tire, whether it's your car or your motorcycle, it's giving you the recommended pressure as a cold pressure, or before you ride or before you drive. There's a very important reason for this. You basically just want to set your tires when they're cold and unridden. So it is true that on a morning like this morning, which is a lot colder than it was, let's say, a week ago, my pressure is going to read a little bit different. Now the question is, should I adjust it because of that? The answer, in my opinion, is yes, because pressure and temperature are related. So if your temperature changes, your pressure changes, and you need to adjust that air in the tire to be at the proper pressure. Pressure is still pressure. Okay, but what is the right pressure that you should be running in your motorcycle? That's really why you clicked on this video, so let's get into that. So there's a few recommended pressures that you might be able to find. One is going to be the pressure printed here on the sidewall of the tire. Now this is important to understand. That is not what the tire is recommended to be run at. That is simply the maximum pressure that that tire is rated for. Also, when you inflate it to that pressure, it's going to give you your maximum load carrying capacity. This maximum pressure may or may not be the optimal pressure for you to run in your motorcycle. The next pressure you might be able to find is the pressure that's listed in your motorcycle owner's manual. Sometimes it's also printed in a decal somewhere on the motorcycle, sometimes on the swing arm or on the frame. This is typically a better gauge than a pressure listed on the tire sidewall, simply because the motorcycle manufacturer is taking into account the geometry, the weight, the handling characteristics of that particular bike. Now, it's not perfect because, of course, the motorcycle manufacturer, KTM in this case, doesn't know what kind of tire you're running. So if I run kind of a normal knobby tire like this, whatever they say in the manual might be fine. Maybe it's 15 or 16 PSI. But if I were to put on like a trials type tire, that pressure really wouldn't work anymore because the tire is designed to run at a different pressure. But I do recommend looking in your manual for a few reasons. Now for my 790, I looked at my manual and they give me a road pressure for use and they talk about whether you have a passenger or not, but they also give me a pressure to use for off-road, which I thought was really cool. Okay, so far we've discussed the pressure on the sidewall and the pressure that's listed in the manual or on the sticker on the bike, but there's a third one we want to talk about. So the third option is to check and see if your tire manufacturer on their website lists recommended pressure for that tire. Now, not all companies do this, but I happened to go over to Dunlop's website because I was looking at the Trail Max Emission tire, and they actually have a little feature where you can plug in your exact motorcycle and it'll give you the recommended pressure if you're using their tire on your motorcycle. Now, that's really cool. I mean, the truth is different tires have different rubber compounds. Some rubber softer, some's harder. They have different sidewall designs. They have different sidewall thicknesses. They have different plies. There's bias and there's radial construction. There's all these factors that go into what an optimal pressure might be. So it does make sense to check out the manufacturer's recommendation. But okay, you're probably getting frustrated with me because I still haven't really told you what pressure that I recommend you to use. So let's get into this. So for a road bike, it's a little bit simpler. So if you're using your adventure bike on the road or you're just riding a street bike, the best advice that I would have is probably to run the recommended pressure that's listed in the owner's manual. Now they're probably going to give you a pressure for riding with just by yourself and also possibly a pressure which may include an increase in the pressure to the rear tire if you're running a passenger. And the reason for that is tires have a higher payload capacity at higher pressure, so that makes sense. Now you should also check into if the tire manufacturer has a recommended PSI, and you should balance that out with that recommendation. And that you should also, for the third point, look at the maximum pressure on the sidewall just to make sure you're not exceeding that. So it is possible with a lot of modern motorcycles that if you have a heavily loaded street bike or adventure bike, you may need to run those maximum recommended pressures on the sidewall just because it's giving you the maximum load carrying capacity. It's quite easy to max out the payload of a bike or a tire once you add a passenger, luggage, and all the stuff. Now, sport bike riders and track riders will tell you that this is much more advanced than I'm telling you, and that is very true. I admit that. Differences in temperature, different types of road surfaces, different motorcycles, and different tire compounds will have different optimum pressures, but this is not a sport bike riding school channel, so I'm not going to get into all that, but just keep in mind that that is there. Now, what about for off-road use? A lot of the subscribers to this channel that I'm talking to are off-road or adventure riders. So let's talk about dirt pressures. So we need to understand how pressure impacts how your motorcycle handles. The pressure you put in the tire changes the size and the shape of the contact patch of the rubber against the ground. So I'm going to put up an image here of contact patch so you understand this. This is an extremely important concept to understand because how your tire touches the ground, how it interfaces with the ground surface, whether it's street, dirt, off-road, rocks, whatever, has a huge impact on your traction, your ride quality, and a lot of other factors. So at a proper tire pressure, your tire will have an optimal contact patch with the ground, whether it's dirt or pavement. Also at that proper pressure, weight carrying capacity is going to be optimized. The other thing you have to consider too, especially when you're talking about airing down, is that the pressure of the tire, how it changes the contact patch, also changes your tire's ability to shed water. Now you might be thinking, oh, he's going to mention hydroplaning. And yes, I am going to mention hydroplaning because that's an important safety factor. If you've ever hydroplaned in a bike or a car, it's really a sucky thing to go through. The amount of pressure you run does impact the tire's ability to resist hydroplaning, so you do need to keep that in mind. So an overinflated tire is going to have too small of a contact patch. Whereas an underinflated tire, it could be too small of a contact patch or too big of a contact patch, or it's just the wrong shape, or you're putting weight on the wrong part of the tire. Okay, but getting back to the dirt riding, so what pressure should you be running in the dirt? So we're going to talk about some of the benefits of airing down, but also some of the pitfalls of airing down as well. So the reason that dual sport and adventure riders like myself and like many of you air down when we go off-road is a few things. It really has to do with the compliance of the tire, which means your ride quality, and also the traction that you're going to get out of that tire. So when you're traveling off-road versus on the highway, speeds are generally going to be lower, and your contact patch is going to be very different because of the way the dirt and the terrain presses back up against your tire compared to how that works on the highway. Dirt, sand, mud, and rock have a different pressure against your tire. They conform differently to it than hard asphalt or concrete does. And that's why airing down is often a good thing to do off-road. So basically, because dirt is more flexible, more pliable, and because your tire is going to be pushing down into it more, the whole pressure and force equation is changed, and that's why the optimal pressure may be different. So by airing down to a reasonable level, you're potentially going to increase your ride comfort, you're going to increase your tire's ability to conform to obstacles in the trail, whether it's a rut or a rock or sand or anything like that. But you have to also consider that as you air down a tire, you are decreasing the weight carrying capacity of your motorcycle, and you need to keep that in mind if you have a heavily loaded bike. Also, when you're airing down, and a lot of you have learned this the hard way, you risk, especially on the front tire, hitting something hard at too high of a speed, and the tire will deflect too much, and the terrain or the object in the road is going to impact your rim. Now that if you're running tubes, that's going to give you a pinch flat or a snake bite flat, as they call it. Or if you're running a tubeless like the 790 has, you're going to actually push into the rim and possibly damage your rim. All right, so you've waited long enough. What is the optimal tire pressure for your bike and the type of terrain you're riding in? So there's a lot of variables here we have to consider before giving the recommendations. You have to consider the weight of your bike, yourself, your passenger, and your cargo. So there's a big difference between my 500 here with a little tiny Mojave bag versus my 790 all loaded up with camping gear. You have to consider the type of tires you have, the stiffness of the sidewall of your tires, and also, of course, the type of terrain that you're riding on. But after years of experimenting with this with street bikes, adventure bikes, and dirt bikes, I'm going to give you my general recommended ranges right here. So if we're talking about a heavyweight adventure bike, something like my 1200 GS that I recently sold, on a 1200 or a large adventure bike, now keep in mind these pressures that I'm giving you are the air down pressures for off-road. Like I talked about for the street pressures, you can just get that from your owner's manual. So for off-road riding, or riding that's mostly off-road, here's my recommended ranges. So for a heavy adventure bike like my 1200 GS or a Super Tenere or one of these 1000+ cc bikes that's like over 500 pounds, generally you're going to be looking at sort of anywhere between around 28 to 30 psi in that range. Now that gives the tire enough support to hold up the weight of your bike and your luggage, but it does give you a lot more compliance off-road. A lot of times those bikes are going to have street pressures up at maybe 36 front, 42 rear, something pretty high like that. What about a middleweight adventure bike like my 790 or a Tenere 700 or a V-Strom 650 or on so forth? For those bikes, you're going to be bumping down a little bit from that 1200 class of bike. So I would say around 25 to 28 psi is going to be a good range for you. What about a dual sport bike? Now, a dual sport bike, I typically mean something a little bit heavier, maybe like a KLR on the high end, or maybe a DR650, maybe KTM 690. So for those bikes, you're probably looking at anywhere between like 15 to 22 psi. Now something like my 500 here is on a much lighter weight end of that scale, and because of the types of tires I run, this falls more into like the dirt bike category of pressures. So let's talk about that. What if you have a dirt bike? So dirt bike pressure on a typical knobby tire like I've got on here, these are the Moto's Tractionator intermediate terrain, it's going to be between 10 and 15 psi. Now as you start to lower those pressures, you have to remember that that front tire is the one that's most susceptible to impact from a rock or an obstacle causing a pinch flat or a damaged rim. So be careful with that pressure on your front tire. Usually on a dirt bike, I won't go below around 11 or 12 psi in the front tire. The other thing you have to consider is that you better have rim locks when you're going below like 15 PSI, because when you spin up your throttle, or even if you brake super hard and come to a skidding stop, there's a tendency for the tire to want to stay in place and the wheel to keep moving. And so if you don't have rim locks, you could potentially tear the valve stem of the tube out. Now, what about if your riding is very, very mixed? Like, let's say you have a 50-50 ride plan, which is often how I ride, especially on my 790, where I'm really riding like half the day on the pavement and half the day on the trail. And the trail sections are divided up between different sections of pavement. So what pressure should you run then? So here's how I tackle this. Now, the first option is simply to stop every time you get to the dirt section and air down your tires. Now that gets really annoying really fast, and it's time consuming, and your buddies are going to be waiting for you and giving you a hard time. So the alternative to doing that is simply to set your tire pressures somewhere between their optimal street pressures and the optimal dirt pressures. So like everything in life, sometimes a compromise is what you need. Now remember that if you're running really, really high speeds, like let's say you have to jump on the interstate and you're going to be going 85 miles an hour, the impact of those air down tires is going to be a lot worse, because heat increases with speed and low pressure causes heat to be worse, which is going to wear out your tire faster. You also have to consider your load carrying ability. So be careful with running the air down pressures on the highway for extended periods of time, especially the faster you go. But if I know I'm not going to be going super high speed on the highway portions of my adventure ride, then I'll typically get those pressures down, maybe halfway between the dirt and the street pressures. But honestly, sometimes I get closer to that dirt pressure and I just try to be careful with it and kind of baby it on the highway. Running those lower air pressures on the pavement, like I mentioned, is really going to accelerate your tire wear, because the tire can't support the weight well enough and the heat builds up too much, and so your knobs are going to start to tear and chunk off. Now, I've probably oversimplified this whole tire pressure thing, but there's so much information on this out there. There's so much bad information on this out there. I really wanted to try to give you guys sort of a clarification video about real world experience with tire pressures. So I really hope this was useful. If it was, please give the video a thumbs up. It helps me out a lot. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more motorcycle content in the future. And in the meantime, ride safe. We'll see you out on the trails.